Every empire borrows against time itself. It spends tomorrow's trust to pay for today's stability. That exchange feels harmless at first. It even feels wise. But hidden underneath is a simple truth. Borrowed time always belongs to someone else. And when the lender reclaims it, the silence that follows is more destructive than any war. That silence began drifting across the world in the early 1970s. The United States had just severed the dollar from gold, a promise held since 1940 vanished overnight. Currencies shook. Inflation rose. Nations doubted the foundation of global trade. The world's reserve currency no longer had a physical anchor. The stakes were severe. If belief in the dollar collapsed, American power collapsed with it. No country could afford that outcome, not even America itself. So, the search began for a new source of stability, one not mined from the ground but extracted from geopolitics. It was found in Saudi Arabia, not in Washington, not in New York, but in a kingdom whose oil fields had become the lungs of the industrial world. The arrangement was direct. Saudi Arabia would price all its oil in US dollars and reinvest its surplus revenue in American markets. In return, the United States would guarantee the kingdom's security. A currency with no gold suddenly had something stronger: global necessity. The system endured because every nation that needed oil needed dollars first, and as demand for oil grew, so did demand for the currency tied to it. But systems built on necessity always follow a familiar arc. History had seen this structure before, long before modern finance gave it new vocabulary. The Italian city-states of the 14th century learned this the hard way. Florence's great banks Bardi. Prudes lent huge sums to monarchs across Europe. Their collateral was not metal, it was political need. Kings required funds for war, so the banks assumed repayment was inevitable. But wars failed. Taxes lagged. Promises evaporated. England defaulted in the 1340s, and the financial world Florence built cracked instantly. The mechanism was clear: credit anchored to necessity. Collapses when necessity changes shape. Centuries earlier, Rome faced the same temptation. Its borders expanded faster than its resources. Armies needed silver coins, but the empire's mines could no longer supply enough. Officials debased the currency, mixing silver with cheaper metals. They defended the decision as temporary, a bridge to better times. But each adjustment dissolved trust. Traders raised prices, soldiers demanded higher pay. Provinces resisted. The currency failed long before the empire fell. The true damage came from a gradual withdrawal of confidence, not from a single dramatic moment. Germany carried the pattern into the 20th century. After the First World War, reparations strangled the Weimar Republic. Industrial output faltered. Foreign lenders wavered. The government turned to printing money because every other path was blocked. But a currency backed only by obligation cannot defend itself. Hyperinflation followed. Savings disappeared. Markets broke. Social life fractured. A state can survive such a crisis, but the belief binding its people rarely does. Lebanon repeated this cycle in 2019. The Lebanese pound depended on a dollar peg sustained by constant inflows of foreign currency. Banks offered high interest rates to attract deposits. The illusion worked until it didn't. When inflows slowed, the system froze, withdrawals were limited, the pound collapsed. A financial architecture built on political necessity faced a reality where necessity could no longer guarantee support. Each of these collapses shared a single structure, a currency or credit system tied to something the world once needed but slowly stopped requiring. The shift never appears sudden. It begins at the edges in minor adjustments and quiet doubts. The dollar's relationship with oil followed the same logic. For decades, energy demand ensured the currency's dominance. Nations accumulated dollars. Global reserves aligned around them. American deficits grew, but the world absorbed them because oil created a permanent appetite. As long as the system felt universal, its contradictions stayed hidden. But universality slowly changed. New suppliers rose, global consumption patterns shifted. Countries built pipelines, terminals, and alliances that allowed trade outside the traditional structure. Some began purchasing energy in their own currencies. Others formed regional partnerships. None of these changes were dramatic enough to break anything. They simply reduced the automatic dependence that once defined the global order. Modern financial networks echo the same pattern. Alternative payment systems expand. Digital currencies emerge. Reserves diversify. These developments do not signal collapse. They signal a transition. A reminder that no structure, no matter how powerful, stays frozen forever. A system built on necessity remains strong only as long as its necessity remains absolute. The petrodollar did stabilize the world. It eased inflation, restored confidence, and gave markets a simple anchor during chaotic decades. But it also allowed imbalances to grow. It encouraged deficits, extended military commitments, and transformed financial policy into geopolitical strategy. Over time, maintaining the system required greater effort than building it. Every guarantee demanded another. Every protection required more. What began as an emergency solution became a permanent architecture. History shows how these architectures behave. Florence thought. Political need was reliable collateral. Rome believed its currency could be stretched without breaking. Weimar trusted the printing press more than fiscal reform. Lebanon relied on foreign inflows beyond its capacity to sustain. Each system endured until the cost of balance exceeded the will to maintain it. The present is not an echo of the past, but the underlying rhythm is unchanged. Stability is not a natural state. It is negotiated, renewed and upheld by shared belief. When belief rests on necessity, not trust, its foundation is quieter and more fragile than nations admit. The closing truth is simple. Every system that borrows against time eventually meets the moment when time refuses to lend. Further, and the repayment is not made in money, but in influence. Every empire borrows against time itself, and time always collects. Yet the most revealing lesson comes from how quietly these systems shift. Power rarely fades through confrontation. It fades through substitution. A new lender emerges. A new commodity gains importance. A new alliance creates room for different rules. The world does not revolt against the old order. It simply stops depending on it. That slow drift changes more than any crisis ever could. In the late 20th century, Japan learned a similar constraint. Its economic boom created a belief that growth was endless. Credit surged. Real estate prices soared. The financial system became tied not to productivity, but to the assumption that land values would rise forever. When that assumption cracked, the entire structure froze. Banks carried toxic assets for decades. The economy stagnated. The mechanism was not unique to Japan. It was another example of a system relying on an expectation the world no longer shared. China's recent financial trajectory reflects its own variation of the pattern. Massive infrastructure spending, property-driven expansion, and shadow banking networks created growth that depended on constant momentum. As momentum slowed, the strain became visible in unfinished projects, indebted developers, and cautious consumers. There was no collapse, no sudden break, just the same quiet fragility that emerges when a model requires endless expansion to remain stable. The parallels are not identical to other eras, but the underlying rhythm is familiar. Even the British Empire experienced this shift long before the modern dollar era. For decades, sterling held the world together. Trade routes, naval power, and colonial administration created global demand for the currency. But when the costs of war mounted and new powers rose, the system's foundation weakened. Nations diversified their reserves. Credibility thinned. The pound did not crash overnight. It simply ceased to be the center of gravity. A gradual transition, slow enough for leaders to deny it, yet inevitable enough that denial changed nothing. The petrodollar occupies a similar place in history's continuum, not threatened, not collapsing, but slowly adapting to a world that is no longer shaped by a single commodity or a single financial center. The agreements of the 1970s solved the crises of their era, but they cannot solve the demands of the future. Every structure has a lifespan measured not in years, but in relevance. and relevance fades when alternatives grow stronger, more diverse, and more convenient. The truth is steady. No currency remains dominant because of tradition. No system survives because it once worked well. Endurance requires alignment between power, necessity, and trust. When those three forces drift apart, even the strongest architecture begins to feel the weight of time. If this opened your eyes, subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.